Hi, everyone, and a warm welcome to this launch of a new book entitled Israel's Foreign Policy After the End of the Cold War, authored by our colleague, Dr. Amnon Aran. Oh, more people are joining. My name is Dina Feinberg. I'm a senior lecturer in modern history at the Department of International Politics at City University of London, and I will be chairing tonight's event. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us two experts on Israel and the Middle East engaged in a stimulating conversation about Amnon's new book. Dr. Amnon Aran is the head of the Department of International Politics and a senior lecturer at City University of London. Amnon's main research interests are the international relations of the Middle East, with special expertise in the Arab-Israeli conflict and the foreign policy of Middle Eastern states. Throughout his career, Amnon has contributed to think tanks, policymaking forums, and public bodies, such as the European Union. His most recent book, which we are discussing today, Israeli Foreign Policy Since the End of the Cold War, has been recently published by Cambridge University Press. And I will put in this event chat a link to the book on the publisher's website, along a discount code for those who want to buy it. Anshel Pfeffer, our second speaker, has been a journalist for 25 years. He is currently a senior correspondent and commentator for the international edition of Haaretz. In the past, Anshel covered religion, education, politics, and international affairs. He has reported from 30 countries, which is amazing. Anshel is also the Israel correspondent for The Economist. His last book, Bibi, The Turbulent Life and Times of Benjamin Netanyahu, is available in an updated edition in Britain from Hearst Books. So Amnon and Anshel will spend about 45, 50 minutes talking about the book. There will be time for questions and comments from the audience at the end. If you have a question or comment, you can post it by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. And now I'm going to cede the floor to Amnon and Anshel.
Thank you, Dina, for the introduction. First of all, this is it. I was just saying to Amnon, product placement is key when launching a book, and I've been spending the last couple of weeks with this book. I think it's important to say that it's fascinating. It's a really fascinating, and though we're in an academic setting this evening, I say as a journalist, it's a very accessible book. It's a book that not just foreign policy wonks and students will find interesting. I think it's really the scope of the book, the way. First of all, the time frame of the book I think is quite unique. Taking us from the end of the Cold War, giving us the last 3 decades, really well described in one book. And I think the best thing perhaps of the book, and it's full of really fascinating insights, and as someone who thinks that he knows that period quite well, I found a lot of things that surprised me, and it reminded me things and gave me a lot of points to think about. I think probably the best thing about the book, and I'll start making Amnon's life a bit more difficult in a moment, but let me just say one more good thing about the book, is that it really blends the domestic politics, the internal politics of Israel very well into the foreign policy developments, into the decisions made by Israel's leaders. And that really some of the parts which are most surprising in the book is how often these very sometimes short-term, sometimes sometimes seemingly trivial domestic political considerations were the reasons for quite major foreign policy developments, and we'll talk a bit about that in our discussion now. But I'd like to start by a rather broad question, and that is, you present in the book, throughout the book, 3 paradigms of Israeli foreign policy, and those paradigms are very useful not just to understanding the foreign policy of Israel over the last 3 decades, but also classifying the different prime ministers. You make it very clear, and I think it would be good if you explain this for a couple of minutes, how critical the role of prime minister is in Israel's foreign policy. But these 3 paradigms also help us to understand very clearly, I think, in the book, what each of those prime ministers was trying what and how that each of those prime ministers were trying to further their foreign policy and also their domestic political agenda. So what are those three paradigms, and which of the prime ministers that Israel has had over the last 3 decades fit into each of the different paradigms?
First of all, thank you very much, Anshul, for that very kind introductory, I think, for those introductory words, and thank you, Dina, for chairing it. Essentially, in the book, I lay out 3 paradigms. There is a spectrum starting with entrenchment, and I associate 2 prime ministers primarily. One of them is Yitzhak Shamir, who was prime minister literally when the Cold War ended, as far as Israel was concerned. And the second, who I think will probably be known to everyone here, Benjamin Netanyahu. And entrenchment essentially rests on 3 pillars. The first one is that peace with the Arab world, including with the Palestinian, will be signed in exchange for peace, so no territorial exchange. The second pillar really is that Israel predicates its foreign policy on predominantly the use of military force and military might, rather than, for example, putting a premium on diplomacy. And the third is that the Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza Strip until 2005, will remain under Israeli occupation, Israeli military rule, if need be. So that's really on the, if you like, the right-hand side of the spectrum. Then the center-left really subscribe to a foreign policy paradigm that I refer to the book as engagement, and I specifically don't call it peace because it wasn't entirely clear whether Israel would reach a complete peace. But essentially, engagement really rests on very different principles. The first one was that Israel would make peace with the Arab world, especially with countries like Syria, with Lebanon to some degree, and of course with the Palestinians, in exchange for territory. So Israel would return some of the territories that it seized or occupied in the 1967 war in exchange for a peace agreement and the end of the conflict. The second element was that actually Israel puts premium on diplomacy rather than on military might. And the third that really corresponds to that was that occupying Arab land, or the Arab lands that Israel had been occupying at the end of the Cold War, was by and large against the Israeli national interest. And it's quite interesting that you have prime ministers that once were hawks and turned into strong subscribers of this foreign policy stance, including Yitzhak Rabin, very famously, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, and even Ehud Olmert, who really began on the right, ended up at that position in probably the most generous offer that Israel ever made to the Palestinians from its point of view. And then between those foreign policy positions, I coined the stance of unilateralism. And that really is a stance that rests on different principles. The first one is that actually a peace agreement for any kind, for a set of reasons, cannot be achieved between Israel and the Arab side, including the Palestinians. But nevertheless, the idea that Israel occupies Arab land, those who subscribed to unilateralism, thought that that went against the Israeli national interest. So if Israel occupied lands in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, those prime ministers who subscribed to that view sought to really withdraw Israel from parts or sometimes all of these lands. And then the third element of this foreign policy approach, and with this I will end this sort of brief exposition, was that because there aren't any agreement with the Arab side, the guarantor of any kind of settlement, which wouldn't be official with the Arab side, would have to be with the international community. The main sort of guarantor materially would be the United States, and the main pillar of legitimacy would be given by the United Nations. And prime ministers that were associated mostly with that stance were Ehud Olmert initially, but most vocally and most significantly Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon.
So when we take the 7 prime ministers, we're not including the current prime minister, but we will, I think, come to him at one point. The 7 prime ministers of this period, we have Yitzhak Shamir as the first prime minister of that period, Netanyahu as the last prime minister, both firmly in the paradigm of entrenchment. We have the engagement prime ministers, Rabin, Peres, Ehud Barak at some point, and we have the unilateralists, Sharon, Olmert, Barak, part. And this obviously won't surprise listeners of viewers tonight. We sat for a chat a few weeks ago on coffee in Camden, and you told me that you thought that unilateralism was the most successful of these paradigms. Why do you think that?
I think to date it has been probably the most successful, and maybe I'll say a few things about that. Israel withdrew unilaterally from Lebanon after being really, from the point of view of Lebanese, occupying the south of the country. Israelis used to call it the security zone or the security belt. But as the years went by, Israel, the presence in Lebanon was exacting from Israel a significant price, especially militarily, but also to some extent in terms of international legitimacy. And certainly when we go into the decade following the Cold War and Hezbollah, the Lebanese movement wages quite an effective guerrilla warfare against Israel. The number of casualties, the attrition of the Israeli Defense Force and its ally, the South Lebanese Army, become quite apparent. And in 2000, Ehud Barak unilaterally withdraws Israeli forces from Lebanon in a rather more orderly fashion than we saw in terms of the withdrawal from Kabul a few weeks ago. But interestingly, when we look at this sort of outcome, which was dreaded by many people, the army warned Israelis that it will not be sustainable. By and large, 21 years later, with the exception of the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, the Israeli-Lebanese border has been remarkably quiet. So I would say that withdrawal was quite a success. Gaza is a bit more of a mixed bag. Israel, up until 2005, had about 7,000 settlers amid more than 1 million Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip. Of course, listeners here will be aware of the various conflagrations between Israel and Hamas. But still, for reasons that maybe we can flesh out a bit later, I would argue that Israel's position currently, from its point of view, is preferable than still having to guard, protect, sustain 7,000 Jewish settlers amid 1.1, now more, 1.3 million Palestinians. Let me maybe move to sort of comparing this to entrenchment, which many listeners would say is probably a startling success. As we have seen recently, Israel signed 4 peace agreements with Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, without giving an inch of land back, and Mr. Netanyahu has been boasting about that for a very long time. And of course, in the short run, this is a big success for entrenchment. I think, though, if we look at the outcome or the problems that entrenchment was able to resolve in the longer run, actually the key challenges that Israel still faces remain. Its democracy is threatened by the occupation of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Its own definition as being a Jewish state is threatened by occupying the Palestinians in the West Bank and the ongoing siege over the Gaza Strip, which, at least in Western Europe, several civil movements consider as a form of occupation in and of itself. We can discuss that perhaps. And therefore, really, in the longer run, those 2 challenges remain unresolved. And the third challenge, the ones that Israelis term as the most significant strategic threat, some of them at least, namely the prospects of a conflict with a nuclear Iran, also has not been resolved by this foreign policy maneuver. So if we compare it to unilateralism, I think it's less of a success if one looks in the longer run. Finally, and very briefly, with regards to engagement, the premise of engagement was that if Israel is able to exchange land with the Palestinians and with the Syrians, it will be able to achieve a peace agreement. And maybe for reasons we can discuss a bit later on, both of those foreign policy aims actually failed. And when the moment of truth, if you like, arrived with Syria and with the Palestinians, the formula of a land exchange, resolving and ending the conflict with both of these, with Syria, a country, and with the Palestinians, was not borne out, and actually failed quite dramatically with the Palestinians, and perhaps less so with Syria. So that would be my answer about why I sort of classified unilateralism as a relative success amongst the 3.
So let's talk a bit about that failure, that spectacular failure of the Oslo process, especially because we have now quite a bit of perspective. We have about a quarter of a century looking back, and really that's like you use some of the source material and the interviews you made for this book incredibly well to analyze that period and what the chances were and how it almost seems now inevitable that it was going to fail, but that's also something worth asking. But I mentioned at the beginning how I think really one of the really strong points in the book is how you blend in the domestic politics, the foreign policy considerations. And one of the most surprising details in the book is about Yitzhak Rabin's decision-making. Now, Rabin, we think of him today, especially Israelis who are left of center, and in general, many people around the world who would have liked to have seen the Oslo process working, we tend to think of him as almost a secular saint, someone who was martyred himself on the altar of peace, was gunned down by a Jewish extremist in the because he dared to try and make peace with the Palestinians. And you have some really interesting insight there on what actually motivated him to go to embrace the Oslo process.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly that was one of the most interesting discoveries for me also. As I researched the book, I also sort of was in the position of thinking about Rabin only as a martyr for peace. And of course, to some extent, he was assassinated by a fervent supporter of the Jewish settlement movement. There was a big campaign against Rabin around the Oslo process. So of course, in many respects, Rabin was assassinated for what the Israeli right, and especially the extreme right, perceived to be a peace plan, which Rabin had already decided on as a result of sort of transforming himself from this very serious, hawkish, hard-nosed security man to a benign, and perhaps many of them thought a naive peacemaker. But I think having looked at that much more closely in the book, I became less convinced with this transformation by Rabin. The first thing about the very decision to engage with the Oslo process, and I think that's something that's quite worthwhile to say something about, because it does really illustrate this linkage between domestic politics and Israeli foreign policy. So back then in the summer of 1993, Rabin was presented with a serious dilemma. He had sent a message to the then Syrian president, Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president, with what Rabin thought was a very generous offer about exchanging, effectively returning in a staggered fashion, the whole of the Golan Heights in exchange for a fully normalized peace. And Hafez al-Assad, who was known as a very tough bargainer and a very tough negotiator, gave him a very tough reply, which basically said, well, I'm not really impressed with this offer. If you want to move ahead, then you need to rethink some of your key parameters. You know, if you want to withdraw, you have to withdraw in 6 months. I can't promise necessarily to have full normal relations straight away, and so on and so forth. Rabin was taken aback by this response, but if that was the case, presumably Rabin would have known that this was an opening response in an answer to his opening gambit. And presumably there could have been more time to try and thrash that out. But what was also happening at the same time was that, of course, there was a secret Israeli-Palestinian channel held in Norway, Oslo, headed by Rabin's foreign minister, Mr. Shimon Peres, who for many years was Rabin's nemesis to a large degree. And two very important sources, one of them, the chief negotiator with Syria, Itamar Rabinovich, and of course, another gentleman who was the chief aide of Peres himself, so two of them individually, stated very clearly that Peres came to Rabin and said, look, we've now reached a point of fruition with the Oslo process, and if you do not endorse it, I will, in sort of Peres's colloquial way, I will do a political intifada to you in your own party. I will present you as the enemy of peace. I will say that you don't want peace. And Rabin had very, very strong memories from his first term about the trouble that Peres can do. And at that point, really, I think it could be argued quite strongly, which I do in the book, that Peres was really able to force Rabin's hand down on endorsing the Oslo process before giving him enough time to try and explore the peace agreement with Syria to a greater degree. So I think when we look at the Oslo process, it was not only a strategic decision by Rabin, he did resign himself to it after great difficulties. But this sort of political catalyst was absolutely instrumental to understand Rabin's decision at that moment in time to opt for the Palestinian track rather than the Syrian track, which was that Syrian track his actual priority as he himself stated it in the elections. So I think that's in terms of the reasoning that was really behind Rabin. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about how the actual Oslo process evolved, but maybe I'll leave it at that and return it back to you.
Right. Well, I would like to ask another question about Rabin and the Oslo process, which I think is kind of key to perhaps understanding why it eventually failed. And even if there are many reasons, I think, why the process has failed. Who knows? Maybe one day it can be resurrected, and I think we'll talk about that as well. But you bring a very important quote. It's a quote that I remember from back in the past reading, but it's really, I think, to me, perhaps one of the key moments. It's from a speech that Rabin made in the Knesset just a few weeks before he was assassinated. This is October 5, 1995, and Rabin gives what was at the time his most evolved thinking on what would be the end game, how he saw the Israel-Palestine conflict being solved. And people today tend to talk about the two-state solution as like that is what the Israeli center-left has always believed in, but obviously it's also evolved over time. And Rabin never ever supported a Palestinian state. He said at the time, October 1995, in the Knesset, that what he sees coming into being is, and this is the quotes, a Palestinian entity less than a state, and he explained it, a demilitarized Palestinian state covering Gaza and 50 to 60% of the West Bank. Now, almost that same formulation was used in the last few years by Netanyahu himself. So basically, now a lot of people who did know Rabin well, claim to this day that had Rabin lived, then he would have also come around to a position of full statehood for the Palestinians. But there is no evidence of that. And do you think that shows us that perhaps Oslo was almost bound to fail? Even if Rabin had lived, even if Rabin had won the next election, which would have taken place a year later and continued in power?
Well, I think first of all, I'm quite critical about how Rabin managed the Oslo process, and I think what you've just said is just one example. And I think you're absolutely right. If the end game, as Rabin stated in that speech, was for the Palestinians to have something less than a state, then that would not have been enough to actually achieve the kind of peace that many Israelis and of course the Palestinians had in mind. The interesting thing also is that two individuals that worked very closely with Rabin, one of them was his chief of staff, the late Eitan Haber, and another individual who actually put it in his book, who then became head of Mossad, Mr. Dani Yatom. Both of them actually corroborate the fact, or they claim at least, that in informal conversations that they had with Rabin, he was not thinking about ever having a Palestinian state on more than, say, 60% of the West Bank. So this is very similar, as you rightly say, Anshel, to the kind of plan that Mr. Netanyahu presented only recently together with Donald Trump. And this is exactly why I maintain that I'm not sure that Rabin really came round fully to this notion of reconciliation, which was held by the center-left or by the left wing of the Labour Party. And I actually asked Mr. Haber, who was Rabin's chief of staff, so how did Rabin think he could get this done? And he said very clearly that Rabin believed that the balance of power at that point in 1995 was so firmly in Israel's favor that when the end point came, Israel, together with the international community, could impose this kind of arrangement on the Palestinians. And that is quite commensurate with the very securitized approach that Rabin took to negotiating the Oslo process. He involved the army, he brought the generals, he kicked out all the members of the former Peace Now, people like Dr. Yossi Beilin was instrumental. The academics that started the Oslo process were also excluded. So by and large, Rabin was very, very, very bent on security, perhaps too hell-bent on security, and really did not factor in sufficiently the notion of reconciliation, and perhaps also didn't take seriously enough the fundamental issue that the Palestinians came with to this table, namely having their own Palestinian state.
So let's fast forward a bit, or quite a bit. Let's fast forward 26 years, and I'd like to take us to a very recent event, and that was the new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's visit to the White House a couple of months ago. And we saw there something, I think, really fascinating, because this was the first time that a new Israeli Prime Minister was meeting a new Democrat, a new right-wing Israeli Prime Minister was meeting a new Democrat president in 12 years. The previous time it happened was when a recently re-elected Netanyahu arrived to meet Barack Obama in 2009 in the White House. So 12 years had passed. Now, when Netanyahu met Obama for the first, well, it wasn't the first time they met. They'd met a few months ago when both were still had not yet been elected. Obama was doing his famous rock star tour of the world after he'd won the Democrat nomination, and he came to Jerusalem and he had a quick meeting with Netanyahu. This was their second meeting, but their first meeting in office, their first meeting in the White House. And Netanyahu came, as he does always, with a speech on Iran, and to try and kind of downplay the Palestinian issue. And Obama literally almost slapped him down and said, we'll take care of the Iranian issue. You start making concessions. You stop with the Palestinians. You stop building in the West Bank. And Netanyahu was really shocked by the cold water response from Obama. 12 years later, we once again have a new right-wing Israeli Prime Minister, a new Democrat president in the White House, their first meeting, and the Palestinians barely even come up. It's sort of almost a side, not almost, literally a side issue in this first very important, I think, meeting. I think first meetings with Israeli prime ministers and US presidents are certainly an important event. What does this tell us? What has happened in those 25 years to so downgrade the Palestinian issue on the international agenda, on the Middle East agenda, so that in this kind of the highest level of international meetings, it's barely even mentioned?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and maybe I'll try and sort of answer it. I think there are a number of levels here. Let me start with, first of all, the Palestinian level itself. And I think really the threshold moment for the Palestinian cause was the aftermath of 9/11. And at that point, that was really the first time when an American president, George Bush, said very publicly that he has no faith in the then Palestinian leader and really symbol, Yasser Arafat. Arafat became a persona non grata in the United States after being welcomed numerous times in the White House. And of course, that elevated his own profile, but of course also the profile of the Palestinian national movement and the Palestinian cause. And from that point onwards, I think what we see, and this is important for me to emphasize, on the level of global political elites in Israel, in parts of the Arab world, and I emphasize that these are elites, certainly in the United States, with perhaps the caveat of the left wing of the Democratic Party, but they're not yet in necessarily the elite position. But in that sort of global elite, the Palestinian cause has become less and less significant. And that also explained to us why 4 countries are willing to make peace with Israel without, with the Palestinian cause not advancing an inch, and arguably some would argue going in reverse. So all the gains, the diplomatic gains that the Palestinians were able to make during the 1990s, including their increasing visibilities, have been really being lost since that moment in 2001 through what was called the Second Palestinian Intifada. But then, of course, they have been also washed away by larger events that took place in the Middle East, which became more significant, most notably the Arab uprisings, the rise of Iran, and of course, more recently, on a global scale, COVID. So the Palestinians, from being quite an important symbolic issue, also for global elites back in the 90s, at the moment on that elite level have become increasingly negligible. And that is true about the West, but it is also true about countries like India and China that I deal with in the book, who in the 60s and the 70s, even up until the 1980s, supported the Palestinian cause vigorously as part of the non-alignment movement, as part of sort of their anti-imperialist or anti-communist stance. All that has changed quite dramatically. But I think that is why, you know, in such a setting, we don't hear about the Palestinians. But I think there is a contradiction here, because on civil society level, certainly in Western Europe, in part of the United States, but I would say also, and most importantly, in Israel-Palestine itself, the Palestinians are still a very symbolic and very important material issue. Israelis can say and feel what they want, and probably the right wing will be very happy that in a meeting with the United States president, the Palestinian issue does not come about. But millions of Palestinians still live in close proximity to Israelis. And I think we saw an inkling of what explosive potential that has in the mob fighting that exploded a couple of months ago around the recent conflagration between Israel and Hamas in various mixed cities and so on and so forth. So to summarize this, I think there is a certain discrepancy here between what has happened on the level of the global political elites and what is actually happening on civil society level, and of course, on the ground in Israel-Palestine itself.
So both of us have written books about contemporary politics, and there's a big problem when you write, you know, historians have this kind of good fortune that they can write about, events that happened in the past, and they know where the book ends. You and I have written books about ongoing events, and the biggest question is always, where do you end the book? And you know, the moment that you finish writing and the book is already with the printers, things are going to happen, and you're going to say, damn, I wish I had that in my book. And for you, it's obvious what that moment is. It's the so-called Abraham Accords, and we've mentioned them a couple of times already. How surprised were you, having spent such a long time researching, analyzing, and writing about Israeli foreign policy in the last 30 years, by this twist of events that, once again, eluded your research this time?
Well, I think on one level, I wasn't surprised once it came out, and that was on the level of Mr. Netanyahu and what he represents. I think Benjamin Netanyahu, many people describe him as an opportunist, as somebody who only works for political gain. And to some extent, like all politicians, that is true. But anybody who's read, and you've written extensively about Mr. Netanyahu, and anybody who's read seriously his speeches and wrote something that, again, in that Cafe in Camden, I think we both agree, a book, A Place Amongst the Nations, which was written by Netanyahu and was published in the mid-90s, effectively Netanyahu has not shifted away from his strategy. He has always said that he is willing to make peace with the Arabs in exchange for peace. He described, and here I'm paraphrasing slightly, but not a lot, a Palestinian state as an arm that would be stretched towards the Israeli artery and squash it or strangle it. That's the kind of vocabulary that he uses. So I think on the level of the Israeli right and what Mr. Netanyahu could achieve, I can't say that I foresaw it, but I wasn't surprised when that happened. I think what did surprise me quite a bit was the move, especially by Gulf countries, but also Morocco, but especially the Gulf countries, and certainly what was a very significant shift in their political elites of effectively saying, we'd much rather have peace with Israel and benefit from the strategic advances that peace brings with it, technology, access to some military components, of course, a much closer alliance with the United States, which probably was the most significant issue here altogether. And they saw those benefits as far greater and more important for their survival and for their ability to thrive and flourish than maintaining their historical stance in support to the Palestinians. That did surprise me, and I think it does reflect a significant shift within some of the contemporary Arab political elites. I'm less convinced that that shift has been adopted on a broad scale in Arab Middle Eastern countries, and we have surveys that probably would corroborate that. And I think there is a gap here that's perhaps for some is easy to ignore, but is very, very significant and will come back to influence the conflict quite dramatically.
So, slightly broadening the scope of your book, going back to the late 70s, in that's 42, 43 years, we have 5, you could say 6 if you include Sudan, agreements between Israel and Arab countries. So by now it's over a quarter of the Arab League. Of those 5 or 6 agreements, only one was achieved by the Israeli left. If you call Labour the left, yeah, then that's Jordan. But Egypt, the biggest, the mother of the Arab world, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. So 3/4 or 4/5 or 5/6, depends how you count them, of these peace agreements have been achieved by a Likud government. Obviously, the first one with Egypt was achieved by Menachem Begin, the man who no one would have ever believed that he would be the first Israeli prime leader to bring peace with an Arab country. What's that tell us? I mean, we both know the famous sort of cynical joke in Israel that only the right wing can make peace and only the left wing can make war. What truth underlies that saying?
I think the one thing that it does underscore is this very tight linkage, and that's the sort of this is the sort of thread that I try to weave through the book, that there is really an intimate linkage between Israeli, not only domestic politics, but also domestic narratives and Israel's foreign policy. And in that respect, when a right-wing government comes to Israel, and that was certainly in the case of Egypt, and presents this as a strategic benefit for the state of Israel, it will not counter a great degree of opposition. So in some respects, you're right. Only the right can make peace. And of course, also from the point of view of Israel's Arab negotiators, a right-wing government, but especially a strong right-wing government and a strong prime minister is absolutely crucial. Like Benjamin Netanyahu, is a much more favorable prospect than a center-left, very weak government or very weak prime ministers. And on that note, I think I just want to refer us up to 2 examples which I examine in the book and I think are quite significant. In the annals of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we commonly think about the proposal that Mr. Barak gave at Camp David as being super generous. And then, of course, there is a later proposal given by Mr. Olmert in 2009 that even is seen to have gone further in the sense that there would be a one-for-one exchange of territory, almost an internationalization of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Even the Jordan Valley would be returned to the Palestinians, and Israel would sort of predicate or trust its defense with forces that would be deployed on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. And often people ask, how did the Palestinians not agree for this? What is this? It shows that they're intransigent. But if you look at these 2 prime ministers, these 2 episodes a bit more closely, so what you see is actually that those prime ministers, politically speaking, were very, very untenable. So for the Palestinians to agree to those proposals would mean that they effectively give up some of the main demands that they had, especially the right for return and the right to have a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. But in no way was it certain that in relinquishing those demands, they would get a peace agreement in exchange. In the case of Ehud Olmert, he was subsequently indicted and sent to prison. And Mr. Barak is considered, I think, by many in political terms as one of the worst prime ministers. His coalition collapsed completely. And actually, when he made the offer, he had a minority government. All this is really to say that, it's not only center-right governments, you also need strong governments. And conversely, of course, as long as Rabin was still a strong prime minister, the Palestinians were very happy to negotiate with him. Whether he could deliver the kind of agreement that he had in mind is still really yet to be seen.
So when Ahmed Tibi said a few years ago that the Palestinian leader who can accept the most generous offer that Israel would propose has not been born, he was saying the truth. There is even with the most left-leaning in relative terms Israeli prime minister, there is not yet a formula for, when we talk about the two-state solution as a formula, there isn't really a formula right now, and hasn't been for the last 30 years or even further going back, for a stable peace agreement between Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, I think Mr. Tibi, who's an Israeli member of Knesset, for those listeners of us who are not familiar with the name, he's a member of Palestinian Israeli member of Knesset. I think he's partially right. So he is right if you look at this in the very narrow negotiation bilaterally between Israel and the Palestinians. But where I think Mr. Tibi is wrong is if you would bring into the fray in the way that the Arab world tried to do, and that's another episode that I tried to deal in the book.
The Arab Peace Initiative.
Exactly, what was called the Arab Peace Initiative. And that idea really rests on the assumption that any agreement that Israel and the Palestinians would reach between them would effectively receive the backing of the whole, or at least the vast majority of the Arab world, especially some of the most significant players, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And I think a Palestinian leader who would have that international Arab backing on an agreement that would produce a viable Palestinian state, that is something that I think a very talented, charismatic kind of Palestinian version of Nelson Mandela could probably pull off with great difficulties, but it still could be pulled off. I think one of the problems that we had in Oslo, and generally one of the problems that continues to beset Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, is that it is kept on this bilateral level, and the regional framework has never really been sufficiently exploited. To some extent, after the Arab uprisings, with the implosion of Syria, with Iraq becoming a very different country than it was back under Saddam Hussein, there is even a greater potential to do that. But unfortunately, at least from my point of view, it has not been tapped into, let alone realized.
So you are of the school who think that the reason that we're not yet close to the solution is more a failure of leadership than a lack of formulas for peace.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the main conclusions that I reach from the book, and I make it very clear, and I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me, is that certainly in the case of Israel, prime ministers have overwhelming power. And the style of leadership, the quality of leadership really does have a fundamental impact on Israel's foreign policy for several reasons, partly because the prime minister really has access to all the information. He has access to the United States. He or her in Israel, we have one prime minister who was a female as well, Golda Meir. But also because he really has the capacity also to decide which foreign policy options, like for example, Oslo or a peace agreement with Syria or the Abraham Accords, he wants to push forward, or she, and which he stops really at the tracks. And I think what we saw with Mr. Netanyahu, who, by the way, I'm not a huge fan of, but I think, you know, credit is due where credit is due.
You're frozen when you try to give credit to Netanyahu.
Israeli side, but of course also from the other side, especially in the case of Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, was very, very significant indeed. So I do think that leadership is absolutely essential. And good leadership and strategic leadership could find the formula that could theoretically one day end this conflict.
So there's one country and one important player that hasn't come up at all this evening in our discussion. And another really interesting point in the book is that you seem to have found the first time that Iran came into the decision-making considerations vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians. Now, Iran is used certainly by Netanyahu, but not just by Netanyahu the whole time, as a deflection or as a reason to do things, not to do things. Very early on, you note the period where Rabin was presented with various assessments about how Iran's nuclear program was going, and this is now once again going back more than 20 years. And you make a point that because Rabin didn't think that it would be so soon, and that the assessments were somewhere between you write here, between 3 to 7 years, how long it could potentially take Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And 3 to 7 years, we're talking here about the early 90s. So 3 to 7 years has become 21 years or 23 years. How do you see Iran coming into these various equations of how and when Israel does or does not make peace with its Arab neighbors? Or do you think Iran has always been an excuse for not making progress?
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's actually something that changed. So if we look back at the speeches especially by Rabin and Peres in the early 1990s, peace with the Palestinians, and Peres is something that we didn't have time to talk about. He had this grand vision of the new Middle East and so on. People might remember it. But,
the old new Middle East.
Yeah, the old new Middle East was supposed to be some sort of replica of the European Union. But strategically speaking, for Rabin and Peres, they said it time and time again, peace with the Palestinians was the door that would open for Israel the capacity to create strategic partnerships with the Arab world against who they refer to as Islamic fundamentalists in their terms. And Rabin began to talk a little bit about Iran. He used to refer to it as Khomeinism. That's the term that he used. So it's interesting that for that government, and also several leaders did, like Ehud Barak, for them actually the way to deal with Iran was through peace with the Arab world, which would enable Israel to have this grand coalition. Conversely, of course, people like Benjamin Netanyahu and also Yitzhak Shamir in that degree, did not see necessarily, did see peace with the Arab world as critical to deal with Iran, and the Abraham Accords, of course, are part of that. But from the point of view of especially Mr. Netanyahu, any step that Israel would take to give up land for that peace would put Israel in a more precarious position vis-a-vis Iran. And Mr. Netanyahu always talks about Iran putting its militias in Gaza in the form of Hamas, in South Lebanon in the form of Hezbollah. And he was able to make this argument time and time again very effectively to the Israeli public that any future withdrawal from territories would end up with Iran extending its presence to territories that Israel would withdraw from. And that was something that convinced many Israelis. What Mr. Netanyahu failed to confess and to reckon with, of course, is that his own strategy of not progressing with the peace agreement with the Palestinians and effectively basing Israel's strategy towards Iran on two main things: deterrence and trying to bring the US to support the Israeli position, has not in itself proven particularly successful. Hezbollah is much more armed than it was. Iran, notwithstanding Israeli strikes, has expanded its presence in Syria. And there is a big debate about whether Iran is closer or not to a nuclear weapon. So I think Iran has been used and abused, if you like, in many ways, but has also played a material factor in the strategic calculations, especially of Israeli prime ministers, especially since the late 1990s, but to some extent even beforehand.
So I see already in our Q&A window that the questions are accumulating. So I'll pass the virtual mic over to Dina, who will present some of the questions. I just want to say, you mentioned Peres's old plan to have an EU of the Middle East. It's just one of many really interesting stories and insights here in the book, which we haven't had time to discuss, but that's also one of the things that make this book so fascinating. So Dina, over to you.
Thank you both for this fascinating conversation. It was really interesting to listen to. Hi, audience members. If you have questions for Amnon, you can post them by clicking on the Q&A button. That's going to be at the bottom of your screen on the kind of very right end. And we have already two questions from Michael Ben-Gad, and I have a question. So Michael's first question is, how close did Israel and Syria come to signing a peace treaty in 2000? Did the negotiations really founder over the difference between the international boundary on the pre-1967 ceasefire line, as was explained at the time or where the difference is deeper?
Thank you very much, Michael, for that question. I think, first of all, one of the interesting things is, and that's one of the myths I think that I tried to debunk in the book with the help of the Israeli negotiator at the time, is that actually there isn't a clear 4th of June line between Israel and Syria. The negotiators tried to find it, but they couldn't. And at some point, the Israeli and Syrian negotiators, especially the Israeli negotiator, Mr. Uri Sagi, said, look, we don't really have a 4 June line. So let's decide what's a 4 June line 1967 that is acceptable to us, i.e. Israel and the Syrians, and let's work around that. So that I think is an interesting thing in itself, and it's to do with the various legacies of British and French cartography and a few other things as well. I think as far as your question is concerned, I would say the following. Israel and Syria, certainly around 2000, were very close to signing a peace agreement. There's a quite an interesting anecdote, but I think is very telling, going back to Anshel's previous comment, that in December 2000, the then Syrian Prime Minister gathers all of the Arab ambassadors in Washington to a iftar dinner, which is the supper that breaks the fast during the holy month of Ramadan. And he says to them, that's December, we have reached a situation with the Israelis when Syria is going to retrieve its land. He was so convinced that, this is in the offing. And then, of course, in January, Mr. Barak arrives to the United States. And on the tarmac, to the amazement of the American interlocutors, he said to them, I'm sorry, I can't do this. The public polls are against me, which shows you again this sort of linkage between domestic and foreign policy. And Barak was under the assumption that he really had to show the Israeli public that he is struggling and fighting and cannot at that moment in time in January, the famous Shepherd's Down summit, he could not conclude then the agreement, which quite flabbergasted the Syrian side. Then fast forward 3 months to March 2000. And I think then really the Israelis did give a credible offer, and an offer that is the only, that if a Syrian leader refused to, which was the case with Hafez al-Assad, there is no other offer, because the Israelis offered to return the whole of the Golan Heights, including back to what was close to the 4 June line, including the areas where the Sea of Galilee was present at the time. Since then, it's contracted for various reasons. If you ask me, Michael, why that offer was rejected by the Syrians in a very famous summit meeting in Geneva between President Clinton and Hafez al-Assad, there are effectively 3 reasons. The first was because Hafez al-Assad was very ill. He died 3 months later in June. The second, which is related, is he was very concerned that if he signs the agreement, his son, Bashar, would need to deal with the Israelis, and he was not willing to bequeath him with that task, especially because he predicted that the more militant sides of the Ba'ath party, the ruling party in Syria, would be highly against that kind of agreement and would try to use it to topple his son. And thirdly, Syrian ideology and the official ideology of the Ba'ath party was always predicated on an anti-Israel stance, amongst other things, anti-imperialism as well. And I think at that moment in March, that perception and that narrative was so firmly entrenched in Syrian politics, in and of itself, it proved a barrier to Mr. Assad from being able to clinch the deal. Whether or not his son Bashar would have been in a better position, we don't know. History doesn't provide us with its alternatives, but they were very close. Those were the 2 moments, and those are the reasons for the failure.
There's an excellent question from Nadim Khan, who is our student, I believe. And it's really kind of types right into this. And he asks, how has the Arab Spring, particularly in Syria, whether it benefited or harmed Israeli security?
I think when we look at the Arab uprisings, which I think is perhaps a better term to sort of capture what occurred, because the spring, as we all know, it was not. I think by and large, the Arab uprisings were very favorable to Israeli security, and maybe Anshel wants to come as well into that. But I'll say in a couple of respects. First of all, one of Israel's key foes, namely Syria, has been dramatically weakened. And I would say furthermore, if you look today at the Arab world more generally, and we touched upon this before, when the Cold War ended, Israel was still faced with quite formidable enemies. Iraq was still under Saddam Hussein, a formidable foe. Syria was a well-functioning country. And the third, of course, was Libya under Gaddafi, who was trying to obtain his own nuclear weapons, but ultimately dismantled it as part of the rapprochement with the West. Fast forward to where we are now, Syria has imploded, Libya has imploded, Iraq has significantly changed, not because of the Arab uprisings. So these countries threaten Israel's security primarily because of their own insecurity and because of their fractured structures. But the kind of conventional, very serious threat that those two countries pose to Israel significantly diminished. The other change, of course, that was brought about by the Arab uprisings, we touched upon this before, is that they did open the space for Iran to expand its influence in the region, which in turn threatened some Arab countries, and at least the UAE and Bahrain. The peace agreement with Israel should be seen very much in that context. So I think in many respects, Israel, at least strategically speaking, is much stronger than before. And I'll just add two caveats to that. One is the fact that Iran, as I said before, has been able to increase its presence in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. But the second thing, and this goes back to the domestic element that I really see as critical in Israeli foreign policy. Israel is still an occupying power. It is still holding millions of Palestinians without rights. That is a serious problem potentially for its state capacity, but it's also a serious problem for Israel's own definition of itself as a Jewish and democratic state, which has been the building block of its alliance with the United States and, of course, with Western Europe. And in the longer run, if that is eroded, that would pose very significant challenges to Israel and its foreign policy. I don't know, Anshel, if you want to add and come into that.
I'd be small to that, and I agree with everything you've said, Amnon. But I think there's also another element that the Arab uprising has changed the way in many ways it's changed the way the conflict is perceived, and the Israel-Palestine conflict is perceived. I think first of all, on a wide international level, you used to get all these prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers coming to the region to try and help solve the conflict. And they would always say that the key to solving the problems of the Middle East is solving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that was a ridiculous thing to say at the time, but it was something that people would say with a straight face, and nobody can say that anymore after all that has happened in the Middle East over the last 10 years. Obviously, that like you said, the Israel-Palestine conflict is still here and it's still an important thing to solve, but it's no longer seen, I think, by anybody serious as a key to solving the problems of the Middle East. It's one of the many problems, but it's not a key. And I think that that on a much more local level, especially in the West Bank, I'm basing this on conversations both with Palestinians and with what you could call Palestinian watchers, that what the Palestinians living in the West Bank have seen over the last 10 years, and especially as the last 10 years came after a previous decade when they experienced a long intifada which left Palestinian society traumatized, they saw how things could unravel so very quickly. Yes, at the beginning of back in January and February 2011, there was still this huge euphoria when I'm myself as a reporter, I was standing in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and we were reporting on this, and it seemed that this new dawn of democracy was going to come into the Middle East. But very soon after that, instead, countries began to implode, and especially what we saw happening in Syria. And I think that from what many Palestinians have told me, there's always this question: why have we not yet seen a third Palestinian intifada? Why are the Palestinians rising up against the occupation? And one of the things which is deterring them is they've seen what happens when law and order breaks down in so many other Arab countries. And for some, the status quo is not something they like, something they're happy with, but it is preferable to the kind of chaos that we saw over the border, especially in Syria. And that, as you said, that has also strengthened, I think, Israel in a significant way.
Thank you both. So a question from Clive Jones. He's effectively saying that, kind of reflecting on what you said about Rabin's securitized approach to Oslo, he's wondering, he says that the security establishment itself sounds like it was divided on the approach, on Rabin's approach to Oslo. So which parts of the security establishment were more influential, and was it actually more influential and more worrying than public opinion?
That's a really good question, Clive, so thank you for that. I think what happened with the Israeli sort of security establishment over I would say, the last 3 decades in relation to the Palestinians is something quite interesting. I think initially the Israeli security services, and what I mean by here is the general security services known in Israel as the Shabak and the Israeli Defense Force. Mossad initially was not that involved in what was happening with the Palestinians. A lot of people don't know this, and this again is the power of the prime minister. Rabin did not consult with the army about whether or not to have the Oslo process. He basically said, look, we've just signed an agreement with the PLO, deal with it. So the security establishment, and Mr. Barak, who was then the chief of staff, then became prime minister, I think he coined the famous phrase that the Oslo process is like a Swiss cheese, it's full of holes. And this was this was sort of the initial position of the security services. They were very skeptical about the agreement. Remember, our listeners will know that Israel had been fighting the PLO for decades, and suddenly it's become a peace negotiator. So there was a lot of skepticism, but there was also another important element which actually was revealed to me very much in the book of Ephraim Halevi, who was the head of Mossad, but also was quite exposed to the military and to the general security services. It was very difficult for the security services to undergo the shift. Remember, these people, the Palestinians, were people that they were used to put under arrest, chase in the streets of Nablus and Jenin, and suddenly they're supposed to be on an equal footing. And that was a very, very difficult psychological shift to undertake, probably one that was never really undertaken, certainly not in the first year. So I think initially, really, the security service went with the government, but was highly skeptical. And as the security situation in Israel deteriorated, the security apparatus, especially the IDF, was able to take over the civic element of the Oslo process. Then I would say, without sort of going into too many details, I would say that there were 2 other phases. The next phase was, especially when violence really became terrible between Israel and Palestinians, suicide bombings, really hundreds, thousands of people dying on both sides. Then there was a big division in Israel's security services, especially the GSS, the Shabak, people like Ami Ayalon still had faith in the Palestinians. And the reason why they had faith is because they said, the Palestinians are fighting terror. They are fighting terror very strongly, not because they love us, but because they want to keep in the Americans good books. But the IDF, on the other hand, was very, very skeptical. And there was actually a very profound debate within Israel's security services about whether the Palestinians are orchestrating the violence or whether the violence is getting out of control. And I think I myself side with the latter position, but that was a major division within the Israeli security services. I think since about the mid-2000s, the Israeli security services has sort of become more, by and large, more of a consensus. So there is a consensus that Hamas is an implacable enemy. With the Palestinians, it is possible to make pragmatic agreements, but that a Palestinian state is probably a threat to Israel. That said, I would say, and this is very interesting, is that 5 of Israel's prime ministers since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps all of the former heads of the main security services that deal with the Palestinians, namely the Shabak or the General Security Service, all of them were against the territorial status quo. They all wanted to roll back the Israeli occupation, at least to some degree, but they could not agree about what would be necessarily its replacement, a Palestinian state, a state minus, or just conflict management.
Right, so Anshul was talking how easy it's to write history. Thanks, Anshul. But then we have 3 questions from students who are actually asking you to look into the future. So I'm going to pose them like together. And if you could kind of give your kind of look into the glass or whatever, and give a brief answer, because we have more questions in the pipeline, but I would be very curious to hear what you have to say on this. So Nadim is asking, what could be the solution regarding Jerusalem? Mohammed is asking, would the possible return of Eli Cohen's body to Israel potentially restart the positive relations with Syria? And Sarah, who is a student at the London School of Economics, is asking if you think that the Abraham Accords could be extended to other Arab states.
So I just didn't get the second question, sorry, by Mohammed.
So if the return of Eli Cohen's body could help restart a positive process of relations with Syria.
Okay, so thank you for those 3 questions. I think they're very good, and I'll try and answer them fairly briefly. I think the answer to the first question I probably already alluded to. I've been a strong supporter of the Arab Peace Initiative. I think the only potential solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that involves the main Arab players, and that probably touches into Sarah's question as well. Which is, yes, I think the Abraham Accords could potentially extend, most importantly, to one country, which is Saudi Arabia. Recently, of course, acquired parts of Newcastle United. So if it's acquired parts of Newcastle United, what prevents it from joining the Abraham Accords? But putting that aside, that does depend a lot on one actor, which we didn't talk a lot about, which is the United States. The United States, I think, under Clinton, under even George W. Bush, failed miserably as a mediator. It was much more effective under Trump and understood what is needed to bring about these agreements. I think with effective US involvement, the Abraham Accords could potentially be extended to Saudi Arabia. That would be the next sort of potential suspect. But we are not there yet. And Saudi Arabia also, because it has a much stronger claim to be the leader of the Arab and importantly the Islamic world. Saudi kings are often referred to as Hadim al-Haramain and Sharifain, the servant of the 2 holy shrines. The issue of the Palestinians is much more central to Saudi identity than, let's say, the Emirates or Bahrain or countries that are further afield like Sudan or Morocco. But I think if there is a potential, Saudi would be probably the next one, or, which might surprise people here, Iraq. Iraq is also a potential country, again, which has transformed quite dramatically. And Iraq hasn't got effectively a conflict with Israel over territory or over anything else. But again, Iran has a strong influence in Iraq, so that would be a tough sell as far as Iraqi politics are concerned. I think about the last question in relation to Syria, it really depends who would be that coherent entity, right? If somehow a tough general who is very pro-Western would take over, then maybe yes. But if it's somebody that is more akin to Iran or something that is closer to Hezbollah or what we've seen in Afghanistan, then probably not. At the moment, though, I should stress that probably the Assad regime, with the help of Russia and Iran, is still able to control parts of Syria, and it would be very difficult to unseat that regime under the current circumstances.
So, question from Klaus Brummer, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. A really interesting one. From a comparative foreign policy perspective, how general or rather country specific are the 3 foreign policy stances that you described, like entrenchment, engagement, and unilateralism? So could you essentially analyze any country's foreign policy through those 3 lenses and what you associate with that in terms of instruments, interests, etc.? Or are they specific to Israel? So effectively, can we take your model and project it elsewhere?
Thank you very much, Klaus, for that question. I think the stances themselves could probably be rolled out. I think what potentially is maybe has a greater potential to be rolled out is the actual sort of domestic sources that I talk about. So these sort of concentric circles which the book revolves around, prime ministers at the very center, the security network around them, and then national narratives, and what they do is impose the sort of contours, the boundaries that are very difficult to stretch, but are possible to stretch. I think those are definitely extendable on a comparative foreign policy perspective. And I also think that there are a few other elements in the book. I would say negotiation is a foreign policy tool. Israel, very interestingly, has been able to gain dividends simply by negotiating. And those dividends were especially accrued vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis India. As we all know, there's no peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, but right when the Oslo agreement started, that's when really the point when commerce, strategic cooperation, especially with India, less so with China in terms of strategic cooperation, really picked up. So I think to answer directly to your question, I probably need to think a bit more about whether the three foreign policy stances can be extended. But I think the domestic context that I outlined, and certainly some of the themes and the tools that I refer to in the book, like negotiations as a foreign policy tool, could be certainly extended to other cases.
So we have 2 minutes left until our official end time. So I think I'm going to steal the last question for myself, actually. And so your book is called Israel's Foreign Policy Since the End of the Cold War. And I was wondering if you can speak to how the end of the Cold War shaped Israel's foreign policy.
That's a great question, and thank you for that. And maybe I'll let also Anshul reflect on that as well. But the end of the Cold War really, that's, I think, one of the key points that I try to say in the book about Israel, and I think I'd say it about any country. You can't really talk about the impact of the Cold War impacting Israel in a particular way. What happens with these international events is that they are filtered. They are interpreted by domestic players, and each of them take a different interpretation, and then they translate that interpretation into their own foreign policy. And Israel is a classic example of that. The Israeli center-right, as far as it was concerned, the Cold War was meaningless. And they said that to the Americans quite explicitly. They said, look, the Cold War's ended and there's peace around the world, but the Middle East is the same Middle East. And there's a very crude statement by the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, which I'm not sure I'll repeat here because it's not very politically correct. But basically what he said was that the Arab desire, as he interpreted, to conquer Israel and, in his words, push the Jews into the sea has not changed. So the end of the Cold War, yes, Cold War, no change. And therefore, for him, Israel's foreign policy of entrenchment should be continued until the Arab side is resigned to the fact that Israel is there to stay, it cannot be defeated, and it decides to make peace without Israel giving an inch of land back. Then you had a completely contrasting interpretation, and that was the interpretation of people like Rabin and Peres. They were much more optimistic about the end of the Cold War for Israel because US, the strongest ally, emerged on the top. Iraq was defeated. They had much more faith in the ability of Israel to sign a peace agreement with the Arab side, and also had more faith about Arab intentions. And they were also much more pessimistic about Israel's ability to endure as a Jewish and democratic state in the post-Cold War context. Remember, where peace seems to be expanding, democracy as a principle was seen to be expanding. And they thought that in that context, Israel would be completely out of kilter. And that's why they really go with this sense of urgency to try and end the conflict with the Arabs. And Rabin, forgive me, said that time and time again. Moving back to Netanyahu, he completely agreed with that. He said Israel can remain, he won't say an occupier, Israel will say Israel can continue to hold the West Bank until further notice, nothing will happen. And Netanyahu argues, can bring 4 peace agreements. So I think the question that we as scholars of international relations always have to ask is not what's the impact of an international event on a country, but rather how the key players in the country filter and interpret that event and what they do with that interpretation in terms of pursuing the foreign policy of their respective countries.
I just add here 2 very short points. I think that when we talk about the end of the Cold War, and this is Dina's field more, but when did the Cold War end? And sometimes you see in various parts of the world, the Cold War was less of a factor at different points. And I think the parameters began to change vis-a-vis Israel's relationships or hostilities with the with some Arab nations earlier than when we normally see the Cold War ending with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But already in the already from the mid-70s onwards, when it became clear that Egypt wants to engage through the United States with Israel, and Egypt already was cutting off its military ties with the Soviet Union already from the early 70s onwards. And then in 1982, when in the first Lebanon War, in the part of the first Lebanon War, which was a clash between the Israeli Air Force and the Syrian Soviet supplied Air Force and anti-aircraft batteries, it was sort of clear then that the Soviet Union is on the way out of the region as a major power, and the region was becoming less and less part of that. So I think that in that sense, perhaps the Cold War ended for Israel and its neighbors earlier than it ended in Europe. And I think the other thing is that the effects of the end of the Cold War have yet to be felt fully, in the sense that it led to over 1 million citizens of the former Soviet Union moving to Israel, and they're only now, I think, coming into their own as a significant swing constituency. And we saw how they, I think, moved the balance away from Netanyahu in the last 2 years, both through Avigdor Lieberman, the most prominent former Soviet politician, but also through, I think, a lot of voters who have started to drift away from the Netanyahu camp. They may still be quite nationalist, but they're not part of that camp. And I think that if we're going to see in the next 10 or so years a major change in Israeli policy, it's going to be a large point because of that group of Israeli voters slightly moving away from the nationalist right towards a more pragmatic position. And I think we're beginning to see it now, but this is more of a prediction. And that may be the long-term effect of the end of the Cold War on Israel and on its foreign policy.
I just have one more point about this notion of the end of the Cold War, because we often talk about not being Eurocentric. And if we look at the end of the Cold War, as we refer to it, effectively, this was a European event. China, as far as I know, is still a communist country, and I think when the Cold War ended, everybody said, the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth. And if we want to look at some of the seeds that were laid at the time for the current geopolitical rivalry, the end of the Cold War, perhaps in parts of Asia, still endured, which is something that we're still dealing with today. So I think when we think about this idea that the Cold War ended, yes, it did end in Europe, but in other parts of the world, this kind of rivalry between the West and other parts in this paradigm of a Cold War perhaps has endured more than we care to notice.
And on that fascinating note, I'd like to thank again Amnon Aran and Anshel Pfeffer for this amazing conversation, very stimulating discussion. I'm sure that I'm joined by the audience members back at home. Amnon's book is called Israeli Foreign Policy Since the End of the Cold War. It is available via Cambridge University Press. Here, Anshel holds the picture. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Amnon and Anshel, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.